everybody, so we're going to get started with our watercolor tutorial. So first thing that you're going to need is your sketchbook, and this is our mixed media sketchbook made by Canson. Really great, nice heavyweight paper. You're also going to need some sort of cup of water. I've started painting a little bit, so mine's kind of green. And you're going to need some sort of palette. So mine's just a Tupperware container lid. You can use a watercolor palette or something like this. It's very inexpensive. Paper towel is great as well. Last thing that you're going to need, obviously, is your watercolors. So here I'm using watercolor in the tube, but you can use watercolor in a pan as well. The techniques are the same. So the first thing that we're going to start with is our wet on dry. Wet on dry. And we're also going to set up another technique called glazing. So wet on dry is just like it sounds. You're going to get some of your watercolor here wet. I'm just adding some water into it from my brush. And you're going to paint directly onto your paper. Simple as that. Your next technique we're going to set up for is glazing. So I'm going to use my lighter value, and I'm just going to paint a section for glazing. As you can see, I'm really not worried about the size or the shape of these sections. Just worried about painting. Now we're going to do a technique called flat wash, and this involves painting onto your paper first. It helps the paint spread out differently than wet on dry. So we're going to paint an area just with some water. We don't need to puddle it, we just need to get the paper wet. And then we're going to add our watercolor to this section. What this does is it helps the watercolor spread out and the pigment spread out a little bit differently. So now we're going to do a graded wash. The graded wash allows us to change from one value to another, so like a gradation, and I'm going to get the paper wet here too. It just helps blend these colors a little bit more, and I'm going to start with my darkest pigment here towards the top. And as I go down towards the bottom, I'm adding more water in my paintbrush. You can see that it's already starting to blend. I'm rinsing my paintbrush out, and I'm just adding more water down at the bottom. And I can kind of tap this and spread it down into the water below. You can see that we're getting that gradient of color here. You want to avoid having a line in your gradient, so playing around with your color allows you to get that nice soft edge. A variegated wash is another thing that you will need to learn how to do. It really is just blending one value into another of different colors. So again, we're going to start with the wet section. And I'm going to start with my lightest value over on this side. And I'll work with my darkest value over on this side. And then have the two values blend together in the middle. Alright, now our glazing section is significantly dry, so we are going to work on glazing. So we're just going to lightly go over our yellow here with some blue. And let that dry. Let me show you one more glaze layer here. All right, now we're on a technique called dry brush. It's very important that your brush is dry, so you can see me kind of taking my round brush and really drying it off on to the side. Some paint, dot it off, and just slightly brush with it. It builds up a texture. This is a really good technique if you're trying to get clouds or something really light. Again, that's called dry brush because your brush is dry. This one's one of my favorites, adding salt. To your paint is a lot of fun. So I'm going to work with a wet section because it will hold the paint longer with it already being wet. And I like doing this with my darker valued color because it shows up more. You want to do this quickly while your paint is still wet. And I'm just taking sea salt here. I'm going to sprinkle it on top of my paint. And while that dries, I'll let you watch that and see what happens. All right, after your salt dries, that's what it's going to look like. Where the salt was, you'll find little areas where the pigment has kind of been pulled up through the salt and is gone. Any area where you pulled the salt up too soon, you're not going to see as much of that because the pigment's going to just kind of seep in. Our last technique, we're going to work with, again, our darker valued color. And this is lifting. So we're going to need a dark color, and I'm using some paper towel here. There's two ways that you can lift something. You can flat wash your paint, and then take a paper towel that's scrunched up and just lift it up that way. Alright, the last way that you can lift color off of something is if you take a wet paintbrush and you kind of just work into a section. It's going to lighten that paint and pull some of it off. You'll want to take that pigment and put it somewhere. So having a paper towel handy nearby so you can wipe your paintbrush off will be really helpful. Now this is nice when you need something to be a lighter value, but it also can be a hindrance if you don't want that to happen. So we did lifting with the paper towel and with our brush. Alright, so let's talk about creating something that actually has value changes. So in my colors here, I have yellow, blue, and a dark green. So my yellow is going to inherently be my lightest color. That's just pretty typical. And then my blue will be my medium, and my green will be my darkest color. So what I want you to think about is the three colors that you have, and what is your lightest, what is your medium, and what is your darkest. And create a value scale for those colors in your sketchbook. So I'm first going to create a nice wet section. I'm going to start with my yellow here. That is my lightest value. And then my blue here is my medium. And then I've got this beautiful dark green. That is my darkest value. If you have a whole pan of watercolors, or you have your own watercolors, feel free to use more color. You don't have to just do a value scale of 3 values. It is simpler to have a value scale of 3 values, but feel free to use more if you would like. Alright, so now we're going to paint our sphere. For this, I recommend having clean water. I'm going to start with my yellow in my lightest area. So my light is here, it's shining down towards my sphere, which means that this is going to be a very light yellow up here at the top. So adding that yellow in, I'm going to brush it out with a clean brush. So I just rinsed my brush out, and I'm going to brush it in a circular motion. Remember how we did our shading before. And before this dries, I'm going to start adding in a very light value of blue. I tend to work with very thin layers. I like glazing a lot. It allows me to fix my mistakes as they're happening instead of trying to fix them after everything is dry and really, really concentrated. Add some of this dark green down here towards the bottom. I'm going to take my nice round brush now, so this has a good point to it. Pick up some of my green paint and just create a concentrated shadow down towards the bottom. I'm going to rinse this out a little bit, add some water, and right along the edge of that light green, I'm going to add just a tiny bit of water so that helps blend into the rest of my sphere. All right, with a clean brush, I'm going to lift some of my color off here in the center. Nice and wet, taking a paper towel, I'm going to dot it, and you can see how that made a highlight right in this area here. So now I've got my sphere all painted, my different values. I can go back and add some of the yellow back in because it seems like I've really got an edge there. Let's kind of play around with this. Light, medium, dark values. If I wanted to, I could even add a little bit of a shadow. But I want to make sure that this bottom part is really dry before I do that, because if I add any water to this, it's just going to bleed, kind of like how this has bled into itself deep in. So give this a try, and then make yourself your own little watercolor painting of whatever you would like to create. Maybe it's something in front of you. Maybe it's something that you have in your imagination or in your head. Maybe it's your favorite thing to draw. So have some fun with watercolor and explore on your own.